This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
The following program is part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV Programming Guide for the date and time Part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
I did provide you with a handout here that just gives a brief introduction to integrated pest management. You do have your Master Gardener Handbook. You have you have more than enough information probably to start figuring out what integrated pest management is. This just gives you a very quick and dirty guide for integrated pest management for certain insect pests. In addition to being the director of the IPM Education and Publications, I'm also an extension entomologist in the entomology department at Davis, so my emphasis is on management of insect pests or arthropod pests. The final page in your handout, and I guess you guys maybe don't need it since you do get the binder with the pest notes in it, is a table of contents for the pest notes. And these are really important publications for you to become acquainted with. We update them quite frequently, so always keep on top of the revision dates. Make sure you have the most recent version of the pest notes. This is the January 2002 list. I think we're going to put out another 5 or 6 pest notes this month, so on things like sudden oak death and some of the new pests. So we do try to keep up to date on the pests as much as we can. The pest notes are on the World Wide Web at the UCIPM website, which is the website's also listed here on your handout. The good thing about the pest notes on the web is that they all have lots of color pictures, not only of the pests and damage symptoms, but also of natural enemies and sometimes links to other information. So you might want to take a look at them on the web as well. So now I'm going to go to my slides. So I'm talking about integrated pest management today, especially tailored for master gardeners. The central concept in an integrated pest management program is that you're working in an ecosystem. You're not working in a vacuum. It's not just you and one bug on your plant and a can of Raid to spray it with. That bug exists in an ecosystem. It's there because certain environmental and biological factors have made it a good place for it to be, and we need to understand what those are. We also need to understand whether or not that bug's doing any damage before we get out a can of Raid. Often there's something we can do to manipulate the environment to make it not as good a habitat for a pest. And so the underlying concept of integrated pest management is you're working in an ecosystem. So for instance, here we have a nice park. This is actually a park in Davis, but it's an example of a typical landscape ecosystem. If this was an agricultural ecosystem, for instance, a field of tomatoes, it would be much more simple. You've got one species of plant over several, perhaps 40 acres, maybe a few weeds, but they try to keep them under control. And on that one species of plant, there's really only 10, perhaps a dozen pests that commonly occur on it, and then there's natural enemies on top of those pests. But really, it's a pretty simple system. You can make yourself familiar with all those pests and sort of become an expert on tomato pests and tomato ecosystem in a relatively short time. You take your landscape ecosystem here, you've got 50 different species of plants at least that you're trying to protect. They're not all weeds, there's a few weeds in there too. And so each of those 50 plants has got a dozen common pests on it, and then farther up the food chain, many natural enemies feeding on them and hyperparasites on top of that. So it's a much more complex system. We have a lot of different habitats in here. In a tomato field, it's not shaded, it's all sunny. So you've got sunny areas, you've got shaded areas. There are different micro-habitats that favor different kinds of organisms. And when you plant your garden, you take those things into account so that you get plants growing where they grow best, and that's one way to resist pest damage. So we have a biological environment in the ecosystem. That's all the living plants. That's all the animals that are feeding on the plants and the animals, and pathogens, fungus, and other organisms that might be feeding on them. We also have the physical environment, which includes the climate, the sunlight, the rain, the artificial environment that we put in there, the irrigation system, the sidewalks. The irrigation system there has an incredible impact on the ecosystem. And then, of course, there's people and the dog walking there, because the dog might be digging up the plants, or it might be peeing on the grass, making big yellow spots that you thought were caused by some insect. And the people are always doing things to the environment, too. So that's our ecosystem. One of the wonderful things about being a gardener is you are managing an ecosystem. You're making it yours. You can do little things here and cause things to happen, and integrated pest management is part of that same philosophy. So, what is integrated pest management? It's a way of managing pests, but it's really a way of managing plants or your whole environment to prevent pest problems. And the first goal is to prevent pest problems by trying to figure out what it is in the ecosystem that is causing that pest to be more abundant than you want it to be. And so perhaps it's because you've killed off the natural enemies. It might be because there's a lot of nitrogen there causing active growth of plants, which favors aphids. If you're dealing with a situation like cockroaches in your house, you provide an environment that cockroaches like by having crumbs out there, having water available to them, having a nice place that they can hide, perhaps in the insulation around your water heater or under your cupboards, a nice little place where they can crawl in during the day and hide from you. If you can remove those habitats that allow the cockroaches to thrive, or the food that allows them to thrive, then you can reduce the problem. Spraying with an insecticide does not, it might cause a temporary reduction, but it will not solve the problem and prevent the problem in the future. So with integrated pest management, we're trying to prevent future problems by actually altering the environment so we don't have pests. Very important in integrated pest management to identify the pest. An awful lot of times people go out there and they assume that an insect or a pathogen is causing a problem. They see a sick tree, they say, that must be caused by borers or something like that, and then they go off to the retail nursery and get whatever they're marketing for borers this year and apply it to the tree. Well, what do you know? Maybe that problem wasn't caused by borers. They never even saw a borer. Maybe they saw holes in the trunk, but they didn't see a borer. Maybe many other things could cause holes in the trunks, even birds or woodpeckers. You need to identify what is really causing the problem. Just because you find an insect on a damaged plant doesn't mean that it caused that damage. You take the example of sow bugs. Everybody hates sow bugs, but part of it is because they're really not as bad as people think. They're usually left there sort of taking the blame for something somebody else did. You'll come out in the morning and your strawberries will have a big hole in them and there'll be a sow bug sitting in there. You'll say, gosh darn sow bugs. But in fact, a snail ate that hole in there, and the snail, when the sunlight came out, they went and hid beneath the ground cover you have conveniently placed there, and the sow bug came out and started to eat the decomposing flesh of the strawberry. But you know, you don't actually have a sow bug problem because sow bugs prefer to eat decomposing matter, don't generally feed on rapidly growing tissue unless there's some damage. So if you're just trying to treat a sow bug problem, you won't get rid of the holes in your strawberries. So you need to correctly identify your pest, and you need to know how to monitor for it. So if your pest is snails or slugs, you can't monitor for it by going out at noon every day and counting snails, because there's no snails and slugs out there in the bright sunlight at noon. Maybe you have some areas where you know that snails and slugs hide out, like maybe under your deck, or you might have a board under the board, but you can keep track of them that way. You need to have a monitoring technique that works for the particular pest. What you should be doing on monitoring is, if you expect a pest to occur, be out there before you know the problem will occur, and be on the lookout for it before it comes along. It's a good idea to keep a written record of what happens in your garden. And so next year, with dates on it, many people do keep garden calendars, and if you say, okay, you know, this was the time of the year when I saw codling moths in my apples last year, or this is when the hornworms showed up in my tomatoes, then in the next year, you can sort of be on the lookout for them, and this is be part of your monitoring program. In integrated pest management, the integrating part is integrating a number of different kinds of pest control methods together. Pesticides are generally the last resort in an integrated pest management program. The first resort is trying to prevent the problem in the first place, perhaps with resistant varieties, planting plants in places where they're less likely to have problems, sometimes putting some kind of covers over seedlings. These are preventative methods. Biological control, or using one organism to feed on another, is another type of method. Mechanical control can include squashing or screens or all kinds of cultivation. So you integrate a number of different methods to get a good management program in integrated pest management. And we always choose the safest, most environmentally sound method. And so that's the environmental payoff for integrated pest management. And the critical element in IPM is you. It's the person. You can't carry out an integrated pest management program without some knowledge and knowing where to go for more information when you need it. So it is the person that makes it tick. Anybody can go to the store and buy a can of Raid, but in terms of manipulating the environment to reduce a pest, that takes a little more knowledge and brain work. And so, as we have already pointed out, we have provided you with a number of resources for you to use. You're certainly not in the course of taking Master Gardener training going to learn how to manage every pest that you come across. By no means will you be able to. I can just barely touch the surface here in talking about it today. But what you can learn in your Master Gardener training is what resources are available and how to use them. In the backs of these books, you probably have noticed that there's tables for each. There's about more than 100 species of trees and shrubs, for instance, in this book. And you can hone in on the particular plant species you have, and you can really narrow down the potential problems. I think that's one thing, as we've talked about, in the landscape you can have so many different species of pests, it's really mind-boggling. And there's there's more species of insects, for instance, than any other kind of organism in the world, and nobody can identify these all off the top of their head. And it's even hard to identify them using keys and insect ID books. But you really can make it fairly simple, and it's fairly doable for you to do if you can narrow down the plant species that you have. And so the first key to diagnosing a problem is to correctly identify that plant species, because there's really only a dozen or a half a dozen pests that commonly occur on most of our plant species in California. So learn to use these tables. They will really help you diagnose problems. I have to say, for things like aphids, I'm an entomologist. It's very difficult, it's basically impossible for me to identify most aphids unless I know what plant they're feeding on, because they're so difficult to identify. But if you know what the plant species the aphid's feeding on, you can really narrow it down, because there's several good references for diagnosing or identifying aphids according to species of plant. And then other information, we've already talked about the pest notes, and these you can photocopy, or you get calls or people who want to know how to manage a specific kind of pests. You can photocopy these and send them off to them, or give them the web address for the web page where they appear. The way that they are on the web, they don't really help you diagnose the problem, so you sort of have to know that your problem's ants, so you can choose the ant pest note. And then the little consumer cards that are part of the WaterWise pest control program have much more truncated but easy to read information for people, and they're attractive. People like to pick them up at garden shows and that type of thing. But they don't have the real details on how to do the IPM program, and so people who want more information should go to the pest notes. And the consumer cards focus just on the insect species that are the primary targets of diazinon and chlorpyrifos, which are the organophosphate insecticides that we're trying to discourage people from using because they are polluting the waterways, causing problems with aquatic invertebrates. Both of those products are being removed from the market. In fact, Dursban or chlorpyrifos has already been removed from the market, and diazinon should be out in 2003, by the end of 2003. The preferred methods in integrated pest management programs are preventative and non-disruptive. So you have resistant or well-adapted plants. This is very important. And of course, when you control your own garden, you really do get to choose what plants you plant. I think a lot of times we inherit landscapes which are really non-viable. And sometimes the best solution when you have a plant that just constantly has problems, the best solution is to pull it out and plant something that doesn't have problems. And if it's an ornamental shrub or tree, there are so many attractive species that you can choose that don't have problems, that can provide similar kinds of benefits to your landscape. Why not do it? Discouraging pests through modifying your irrigation, fertilizing, the way you maintain plants, or the way you maintain the inside of your house too. The biggest source of problems in landscapes, the biggest source of plant damage is not any pest, it is not any living organism, it is water. It's irrigation, poor irrigation. We tend to overwater our gardens, and that causes a lot of problems, causes root problems. We kill plants by overwatering. Turf is regularly overwatered. Most of the turf problems we see when you have brown spots are not caused by pests. There might be pests coming in secondarily, but the initial problem is that there's overwatering. So that is the first factor we need to think. But sometimes things are underwatered also, or there's uneven watering. So the sprinkler head may be broken, or the drip system isn't working. Fertilizing also has a great impact on pest problems. Again, we tend to consistently put far too much nitrogen on our gardens than we need. Gary Hickman and Ed Perry, who are cooperative extension advisors in the valley, have shown that trees, ornamental trees, not fruit trees, but ornamental trees in the Central Valley do not require nitrogen at all. Application of nitrogen. They don't require it at planting, and they don't require it after planting. They see no difference in the quality of the trees. Now, nitrogen is we've been talking a lot about insecticides being a water quality issue, but nitrogen is a real water quality issue too, and that's the one we need to take on next, because we're finding a lot of nitrates in the water, which causes real impacts in the aquatic ecosystem. But nitrogen, not only is it a waste of your money, it also contributes to pest problems. Nitrogen causes your plants to have, or over nitrogen causes your plants to have real vegetative growth, lush, spring-like growth at times when it's not supposed to have, and that really brings on the aphids and the lace bugs and all those sucking insects. It's a wonderful environment for them. It enhances their reproduction. You get big blow-ups of aphids as a result of nitrogen at the wrong time. In stone fruits, in commercial stone fruits, where the growers are putting a lot of nitrogen on their peaches so they can make those great big tasteless peaches that you all hate to see in the grocery store. Well, not only is that a problem, but recent research has shown that stone fruit orchards that have too much nitrogen are less resistant to the peach twig borer, which is the primary insect problem there, and also to brown rot, which is a primary plant pathogen problem. And that's because the trees with so much nitrogen loaded onto their systems really don't have the resistance anymore. So don't over-fertilize. Altering the environment to deprive your pests of food, shelter, and water. Talked about the cockroach example, and there are many examples for altering the environment to deprive the pests of shelter and water and food. Well, for instance, take snails and slugs. That's a real habitat management issue. You create a habitat that snails and slugs like. You know what snails and slugs like. They like a lot of moisture. They like that sprinkler irrigation that you put on every morning for 15 minutes. That allows them to slime around on your soil surface really easily. They like the fact that you have provided a nice place for them to hide in the ivy or under the ledge of your deck. They like that. You've provided that habitat. And you can actually reduce the snails by limiting that habitat where they can hide, or reducing the shade, or drip irrigating. These kinds of changes in the environment really can make a big difference. Also, keeping pests out with barriers and screens. The good thing about working in an environment is, in a home environment or a garden environment, is you can actually you can take the time. Home gardeners are willing to take the time to do some creative things with things like screens and barriers. So trap, squash, prune, wash pests off. You probably already do a lot of this. Washing off aphids with water is one of the best ways to control aphids in a garden situation. Also, pruning off, if you're starting to get those infestations in your flowering plum of aphids, you want to prune out those first places where they come in, and maybe you can keep it under control a little bit. And then finally, relying on biological control, which is the use of natural enemies to control pests. And so what is the role of pesticides in integrated pest management programs? We only use pesticides when the non-chemical controls aren't working, and yet the pests are becoming intolerable. Pesticides are a part of integrated pest management program. Integrated pest management does not mean no pesticides. And integrated pest management does not mean organic gardening. However, you can garden organically using integrated pest management methods. It's kind of confusing for people. They're sort of organic gardening, or at least organic pest management, means that you are using naturally derived products. And so there's a set of pesticides that occur naturally. They're either rock sourced things like sulfur, or they are come from living organisms like pyrethrum from the chrysanthemum daisy, or the use of Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacterial disease of caterpillars. But you use those products, but you can use them in an integrated pest management program. Or if you choose not to go organically, you can use the integrated pest management program and then maybe broaden your choice of pesticides to include some synthetic products that are fairly benign for the environment. Rely on the University of California recommendations. Again, you are not going to know off the top of your head for every pest when it needs to be treated and what your options are. So refer to your pest notes, refer to your various publications. Most of them will have some guidelines as to whether treatment is needed or not. But when you're dealing with the hundreds of different species, particularly of ornamentals in people's gardens, there sure are a lot of plants and pest species that we haven't really done very much research on. So some of it's a little bit fuzzy, but we can give pretty good guidance. If you use pesticides, use them in combination with other types of methods. And there's several reasons for this. One is that you'll get better control, particularly if you're trying to create an environment that will reduce or prevent the pests from coming back in the future. One of the big problems with pesticides has been the development of pesticide resistance. For instance, flies and mosquitoes were, back in the 50s, when they were putting on weekly sprays of DDT, the mosquitoes and the flies were developing strains that were no longer killed with the DDT. And so then they had to move on to other pesticides, and as long as they kept spraying them weekly or monthly, there was very rapid selection in the population. And so we really want to reduce the use. We don't want to expose our pests to this kind of rapid selection. So by killing part of them with a cultural control or biological control, and then another part with the insecticide, will reduce the resistance development. And when you use pesticides, we want to choose them carefully. We want to choose ones that are effective against the pest we're trying to control, but also have not too much impact on organisms in the environment that we want to protect. So these would be selective pesticides. And then finally, follow directions and dispose of them carefully, and read the label, and wear the protective equipment. And you hear this over and over again, but I always see my neighbor out there in his bathing suit and thongs, spraying his roses with God knows what. He works for the Department of Transportation. Oh, I got this stuff from the department. I'm just putting it on my roses. And there's this fumes out there. But in his bathing suit. But he is still alive. But we take a responsibility when we purchase pesticides also to dispose of them properly. And I think that's one reason that I don't like to buy pesticides, because you can't just put half a bottle of, you decide you're not going to use any more of the pest, so you can't just put it in your garbage pail and have the garbage man take it off. That's illegal. There's very rigid criteria about how to dispose of pesticides. And so you take a responsibility to do that. You have to take it over to the proper toxic dump site. There's only certain times of the month that it's open that you can take it over there. And so if you do buy a pesticide, that's why I can't understand why people buy pesticides in this size of package, because then you really have a lot to get rid of. This is fortunately empty. Why not buy the smallest possible package. I really wish that the pesticide manufacturers would do a service for us and produce pesticides in smaller packages, because usually if you do have to use a pesticide in the garden, you only have to treat maybe a couple of plants and maybe only once in the season, and that's a very small amount of pesticides. And of course, mixing up pesticides is another issue. I also wish that for home gardens they sold primarily already diluted pesticides, because people do not dilute pesticides properly, and they don't realize the risks that they're taking. So pesticides they do have benefits in some situations. They are necessary, but they bring with them a lot of responsibility that a lot of people don't accept. Okay, so to review some of the parts of the integrated pest management program of preventing problems, here we have a pepper tree, which is a drought-tolerant species planted in the middle of a turf, and it's not doing very well. And that's because you can't water this type of a tree in the same manner that you water your turf. Some people will take a look at that and say, there's a disease on there, let's spray it with a fungicide. No, the problem there is that there's too much water being applied, the roots aren't developing properly, and it's probably going to die unless they change the irrigation practices around. They remove the turf, put it on a drip system, and irrigate it separately from the turf. Integrated pest management of weeds. In a garden situation, of course, the thing that you need for weeds, or the thing that weeds want, is you provide a habitat for them. What they want in their habitat is they want sunlight, and they want space, and they want water. And so if you can plant your garden so that it's so crowded already with desirable species, you're not providing them with space, and you're not providing them with sunlight, and so you're really going to reduce your pest problems through your own landscape design. Mulches are used for weed control. Of course, as with many methods, there's, so you can control your weeds, but when you have a mulch like this, you might also increase your problems with certain other types of pests that, like organic matter, provides a place for slugs and snails to hide. It provides a place for sow bugs and millipedes and things like that. So you have to weigh and manage and watch and monitor. Here we have solarization taking place. This is another physical type of control method. It involves putting a clear piece of plastic on moist soil at the hottest time of the year for about 4 to 6 weeks, and you really can cook it down to about 12 inches and kill pretty much all the soil pathogens, weed seeds, and the nematodes down to 12 inches. Insects can move out of there, so it's not an insect management practice. But you really, if you just have a vegetable garden, you want to get rid of some stuff, it's a good way to improve your control of pathogens. Row covers. A lot of the pests of seedling vegetables, the insect pests of seedling vegetables, they're really just pests during that very vulnerable time before they have about 6 or 8 leaves, things like flea beetles and aphids. And after that, the plants can usually tolerate them. So if you can protect them with something like row covers during that time, that's a good management practice. And I like to show the bug sucker. This is the bug sucker, and the reason I show it is because it shows how, human ingenuity you can be very creative with your pest management practices. The bug sucker was developed by strawberry growers. It's in a strawberry field here in California. It was about 10 years ago now, I think. But alas, during that short period of time, all the insecticides that were registered and effective for lygus bug, which is a key pest of strawberries, had been taken off the market for various reasons, or the lygus bug had developed resistance to it. So the strawberry growers were in a real fix. And so they got creative. It's a high cash crop, and so they can afford to spend some money. And they built these giant vacuum cleaners that they drove through the field field, and they drive them through, and in the front, which is the intake of the vacuum, they suck up all the lygus bugs and chop them up in the back, and the growers were really convinced that they were getting good control with this. Of course, and they said, well, why aren't you recommending this at the university? And of course, the university were very conservative. We said, well, you know, we have to do at least 2 years of replicated field trials before we'll say anything about this. And by the time 2 years had gotten around, they had a new pesticide, and so these things were getting put back into the barn. But the research showed that yes, they were sucking up the lygus bugs, but they weren't getting the smaller ones, which were causing some of the more severe damage, plus they were bringing up some beneficial insects too. So the level of the control wasn't ideal. Resistant varieties. This is a fuchsia plant that has been infested with the fuchsia gall mite. And this is a real severe problem on fuchsias, particularly in the Bay Area, but you do occasionally see it here. But really what I want to illustrate here is that you have a choice when you purchase plants, and particularly when you're investing a significant amount of money in a plant. Take a few minutes to find out if the plant's going to have a lot of problems and if there's some way to avoid it. In the case of the fuchsias, there are varieties, like for instance here, 16 species of varieties that aren't susceptible to the fuchsia gall mite, and so you don't have the problem. You don't have to worry about it. That's the way I like to garden. I like to have plants that don't have any problems. There are 14 species that are susceptible, but they're not that susceptible, and you can manage them by pinching off the distorted buds as soon as you see them. And you know, you can handle that. But then there's 28 species that are very susceptible, and the regular pinching alone isn't effective, and pesticides alone aren't effective, so you have to be constantly pinching and spraying the fuchsia to maintain the plants. Now these particular, if you're interested in the varieties, are actually listed in the landscape pest book, but it does demonstrate the value of searching out information about pest resistance before you purchase. Okay, let's talk about biological control for a while. This is a little poster that the universities put out. It's for sale in your county office if you want it. It outlines about 20, it shows pictures of about 20 of the most common natural enemies that you would see in gardens and farms in California. There's really thousands of potential natural enemies in your garden. You won't always be able to recognize all of them, but these common ones are pretty familiar to many people. And biological control is any activity of one organism that lowers the population levels of other organisms. The living natural enemies is living organisms that cause biological control, and they cause it by predation, so that means hunting down and feeding on other organisms, or as parasites, so they would parasitize pest organisms, pathogens, insects like people fall victim to diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, fungus, protozoa. They're constantly getting sick, and we don't even appreciate it. Fortunately, the diseases that attack insects, although they may be similar or related to human diseases, they're not the same. Again, there's many natural enemies you'd find in your garden, but some of the most common ones, and I'll flip through some pictures of these in a minute, are the parasitic mini wasps. These are little tiny wasps. They're so small that you hardly notice them. They're ant size or even smaller. They lay their eggs inside a pest, and their eggs will hatch inside, and most of the activity happens inside the pest. And they kill the pest and then emerge as an adult wasp. So they're very common. Pretty much most of our pests do have some species of parasitic wasps that attack them. Lady beetles, The rest of these are predators, and you're probably familiar with most of these. Lady beetles, there's a lot of different species of lady beetles. Lacewings, those green, lacy winged insects where the larvae are predaceous. Syrphid flies or hoverflies. Assassin bugs, soldier beetles, predaceous mites, spiders. Those are just a few types of natural enemies. So here is the life cycle of a parasitic wasp, the mini wasp I was talking about earlier. And this is a parasite would be attacking an aphid here. So you have the little wasp here laying its egg inside the aphid. And it is using its stinger to lay its egg. Most people think that a wasp stinger was created to hurt people. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The stinger is an ovipositor or an egg-laying device, and only females have it. Male wasps don't have stingers. That's because they don't lay eggs. And so most wasps, like all these little parasitic wasps, would not dream of stinging a person. They're just using it to lay eggs in the things that they're supposed to be laying eggs in, which are, in many cases, other insects. So she's laying her egg inside the aphid. The egg will hatch. It hatches out into a larva. The larva grows, feeds, and grows and molts inside the aphid until it's a full-grown larva, and then pupates inside what is now a dead aphid, and then will emerge as another adult. So the parasites, they only kill one pest in their lifetime, but because the females may lay a couple of hundred different eggs, they can be very effective at lowering a pest population rather rapidly. And so here we have a little parasitic wasp which is laying its egg inside a bead armyworm. This is Hypersoda exigua. You don't need to know the names. But so she lays her egg inside that caterpillar, and it hatches into a larvae. And what the picture here is showing, we have popped apart a yellow striped armyworm, and this green thing has popped out. The yellow striped armyworm, you can see it is sort of brownish with stripes there. And what has popped out is the larva of the little wasp, which has been growing inside there. And you can see it doesn't have any antennae or eyes or legs, and it doesn't need them because it's got an ideal life here. Mom has very nicely placed it just exactly where it wants to be, and it's just a tube designed for eating and growing inside that caterpillar. And although you can go around popping open your caterpillars looking for these things, it's labor intensive and also very sticky. The best way to figure out or learn that you've got parasites active in your garden is to look for signs of parasitization. And usually that means look for weird stuff associated with pests. And in this case, you can see the dead skin of the caterpillar, and attached to it is a white cocoon with black spots, and that's the cocoon of the Hypersoda parasite. So there's a little wasp pupating inside of that. And this is a very common parasite in vegetable gardens because it attacks armyworms and fruitworms and loopers, which are all common vegetable caterpillars. So you may see these in your garden if you start looking for them. In many parasites pupate right inside the dead pests, and so if you see aphids, mummified aphids or scales with holes in them, that's a sign that there have been parasites that have killed that because they've emerged through the holes. We'll see pictures of that later. So moving on to predators, this is a lady beetle. This is actually Harmoniax rilis, which is the Asian multicolored lady beetle. The red and black lady beetles are primarily aphid feeders. The lady beetle family, the Coccinellidae, are all predaceous on insects, so they're all good guys. The lady beetles are all sort of roundish, convex, and they have very short antennae, and usually their legs aren't very visible from above. A lot of times people confuse the spotted cucumber beetle with lady beetles. But the spotted cucumber beetle, which is a pest and a plant feeder, has very long antennae, and so it can be easily distinguished if you look for antennae. But anyway, the lady beetle group is a very common group of predators in the garden. So we have the adult there, and then over here we have the larvae. Whereas people tend to recognize the adults of lady beetles, they don't recognize the larvae. And the larvae are voracious aphid feeders as well, and they have the benefit of not flying away before they finish their job. And the lady beetle larvae have 6 legs in the front there, fairly distinctive legs that they walk around with. And then there's a pupa. Lacewings, this is the green lacewing. It's a beautiful insect with golden eyes. And the adult of many species of lacewings is not predaceous. It just feeds on honeydew and nectar. It is the larvae of the lacewing, which is the primary predator in this case. And it looks like a little alligator, sort of, but it's usually whitish or beigeish, brownish. Lacewing here has got an aphid in its mandibles, so it's attacking that. Again, very common predators. You often see the adult lacewings stuck in lights in the front porch or something. But they come around when they see a lot of sticky honeydew from aphids, but lacewings are general predators, so they feed on all kinds of stuff. They not only feed on aphids, but they feed on caterpillars, they feed on caterpillar eggs, they feed on virtually any kind of arthropod they can get their mandibles into, including their brothers and sisters. This is an assassin bug, and I show it because it's a dramatic predator and rather attractive and fairly substantial in size. This is the leafhopper assassin bug. It's a true bug. I think you've had your entomology course. True bugs have this triangular spot where their wings come together. They have sucking mouth parts, but instead of using their sucking mouth parts to suck juices out of plants, they use their sucking mouth parts to suck juices out of other insects. So this leafhopper assassin bug pulls that leafhopper out of the sky, brings it down, sticks its proboscis in there, and just goes after it, and all that's left is a shriveled up skin. And so they're very dramatic predators, but they feed on all kinds of things, so their impact on the system is not always clear. Sometimes they feed on beneficials too. They will sometimes poke you. A lot of predators actually will poke you. Lady beetles will bite you if you let them crawl over you, but they won't cause any kind of permanent damage, and these guys won't either. Spiders. Everybody loves to hate spiders, and I don't really know why, because spiders are good guys, especially in the garden. They're all predaceous. They feed on other insects. They're out there hunting all the time. They're large, so they can, or many of them are large, some of them are small, but the large ones can pick off those large caterpillars and do a good job for you in the garden. The only spider in California which really poses a health risk is the black widow spider. And the black widow spider is easily, and it's only the adult or mature female who's big and shiny black and has that hourglass on her bottom, which really causes severe problems for people. And the black widows are generally hidden away under wood piles in the garage. They're not out in the middle of your garden in the sunshine on a big web. Any spider that's in the sunshine and a big web is your friend, and you want to encourage it. And the ones that are out there on the outside of your house getting sun too are not black widows either. Ones that are more hidden might be with the cobwebs. So encourage spiders. And you, I'm sure, as master gardeners, one of the biggest questions people seem to get is, well, I got bitten by a brown recluse spider, or I have a brown recluse spider. And the brown recluse spider, there's a lot of news and media about it, but it actually does not occur in California. You don't have to argue till you're blue in the face about the brown recluse spider when you approach this. We have a pest note on it. Just photocopy it and just send it to them. If people do bring in spiders into the office and there is some question about what they might be, you should send them off for identification. Now here's a nice little predator. You know what this is? It's an earwig. And do you guys consider this a beneficial in your garden? No, it gets a very bad rap, does the earwig. In fact, the earwig is an omnivore, and it likes to feed on plants sometimes, but it also likes to feed on other insects. And if given a choice, I believe it will choose protein. This earwig is feeding on the eggs of the elm leaf beetle, and the elm leaf beetle is that beetle that defoliates our elms every few years. And it's a great predator for eggs of various kinds of insects. It's a wonderful predator of aphids. In Oregon, some of the apple growers actually put little houses out to encourage and increase the populations of the earwigs in their apple orchards so they'll eat the aphids. But there is no question also that earwigs can be pests. They will feed on vegetable seedlings. They can really damage corn silks. They're a nasty pest on stone fruits when they're ripening, apricots particularly, or peaches. They'll get inside that soft fruit and eat out holes. But you sort of have to take a look at what you've got growing in your landscape to determine whether these guys are pest or beneficial. In my yard, I don't have a stone fruit tree, and I don't grow corn, and frankly, I don't grow many vegetables either. I have, an oak tree and turf and a bunch of ornamental trees and some perennial different ornamentals and, flowers and things like that. Earwigs aren't a problem for me because there's nothing there that they're going to damage. If you're growing a vegetable garden, or if you are growing corn or stone fruits, then it's more of a concern. So things are not always what you think they are. So we all love biological control. We love our lady beetles. We love our lacewings, and maybe we'll learn to love our earwigs. But how do we use biological control in our gardens and landscapes? There's three basic approaches to using biological control. There's classical biological control, mass release, and then conservation and encouragement of existing populations. Classical biological control, the first one is when we bring in natural enemies from another country to control our pests. Most of our plant species that we grow in our gardens did not originate in California. Some of them did, but many of them came from Europe or Asia or Australia. And when they first came here, they usually came without any of the pests that control them normally back home. And so there it was, a honeymoon for many years where you didn't have pests or as many pests on these particular plants. But eventually the pests seemed to get over here from wherever they came from. But the natural enemies, and that would be the little parasitic wasps or the predators that keep them at low populations back home, don't tend to come over here on their own. And so what we do in classical biological control is we try to find out the place of origin of the pest, and then entomologists go back there, search out to see what kinds of natural enemies might be feeding on it back there, bring those here, put them through a very stringent quarantine process to make sure they won't attack anything that is beneficial in California, and then if they pass, release them and try to establish them here. And classical biological control has been very effective in a number of cases, particularly for some of our ornamental plants. We take the case of eucalyptus, for instance, when we talk about a plant that came. Eucalyptus was established in California from Australia more than 100 years ago. And for the first 100 years, there were no pests on eucalyptus, and that's why it thrived here. And some people thought eucalyptus itself was a weed, but generally people like to grow eucalyptuses because they didn't have many problems. They grew fast and they didn't have pest problems. It's very interesting that in the last 10 years there have been about 10 major insect pests of eucalyptus have come over from Australia to California and have caused real serious problems in eucalyptus in some parts of the states. I mean, who would have thunk it? I didn't think eucalyptus had any pests. Well, it sure did back in Australia, but on the other hand, they're not real serious pests back in Australia in most cases, and that's because they have a complex of natural enemies that keep them under, an ecological balance back home. And one pest that we have right now that's causing a lot of problems is the eucalyptus, red gum eucalyptus lerp psyllid. And some of you have, if you have the red gum variety of eucalyptus, you probably have seen the lerp psyllid or at least felt the honeydew falling on your head, because the lerp psyllid it's a psyllid, sort of an aphid-like insect, but it has this covering like a scale, but it puts out a lot of honeydew, and it has been severely debilitating red gum eucalyptus in Sacramento and all over the state. And Don Dalston, who's a biological control specialist at Department of Entomology at Berkeley, has brought over some little parasitic wasps, which we hope will keep it under control, but they've established them on the coast. They have been released down in, I think, Wilton area. There's a lot of eucalyptus, and Chuck Ingalls has been working on that project too. So hopefully that'll be another case of successful classical biological control. The mass release of natural enemies. This is when people find out about biological control and they get very enthusiastic and they say, well, what can I buy to control my earwigs? What can I release to control my grasshoppers? People want to buy a whole bucket of some kind of natural enemy and spray it on like a pesticide. And that would be nice, but unfortunately there's very few natural enemies that you can purchase and use in that way, and even fewer that actually work. There are people out there who will peddle natural enemies to you for purposes that they really won't be very effective against. There are a few natural enemies that you can purchase that can be useful in certain circumstances. Predatory mites can be purchased to control spider mites. But in most cases, in most people's gardens, they do have naturally occurring populations. If you have a greenhouse, there's things that you can release in greenhouses. Commercial growers of apples and pears and walnuts are releasing little wasps, trichogramma wasps, to help control codling moth. But there really doesn't seem to be much evidence that that would work if you only have a single backyard tree. Lady beetles, of course, are sold in many retail nurseries for managing aphids. I'll talk about that when we talk about aphids a little bit later. You can get some control of aphids with lady beetle releases, but most of the lady beetles fly away. And it's certainly no more effective than insecticidal soap, and a lot more expensive. So lacewings are widely sold, and I have done quite a bit of research with lacewings, releasing larvae of lacewings, and I've never been able to get them to control aphids, despite the fact I really wanted them to. So most of the time, the main way that we're going to find that we can use biological control in our landscapes, not to say that I don't think in the future we may learn how to rear more effective biological control agents. We may learn how to use them better, and there may be a future in the future. There may be a better future for releasing biological control agents, but right now, particularly in the garden situation, they're only marginally effective in a few cases. In some of the commercial agriculture situations, it has been more success, where you have a monoculture and a lot more of one particular pest problem. So the most important way to use biological control in your landscape is to conserve and enhance the biological control agents that you already have in your garden. You have got hundreds of natural enemies in your garden unless you really nuke the garden on a regular basis. And you need to try to increase the activity of these populations. How do you do this? Well, there's a number of different approaches to enhancing biological control. One of the first things people think about is, well, is there some kind of a plant that I can grow that will increase natural enemy populations? There's a lot of interest in this. It's a real feel-good kind of thing, you know, diversifying your ecosystem so that you increase your natural enemy populations, and certainly there's a theoretical basis for this. Most natural enemies need water, nectar, or some kinds of food sources in order to reproduce and live as long as they possibly can in their adult stage. So if you can provide them with nectar and water, the little parasitic wasps, and some shade, the little parasitic wasps will live longer and lay more eggs on your pests. There are insectary plants that are sold to try to, with the idea that they can increase the populations of natural enemies in your garden. And it's a really interesting idea. The plants that are sold, there's a whole variety of them are sold. They generally are good sources of nectar and pollen, and they bloom at different times of the year or a long period of time. But what I find is that in most people's home landscapes, there are enough flowering plants at any given time during the time that pests are a problem that you probably already have enough nectar and shelter and water for them, provided by the diversity of your landscape. However, if you want to try planting insectary plants, there's probably not a whole lot of harm. There's not a lot of harm to do, and it might allow you to become more familiar with some of the natural enemies. What you generally find is that certain of these insectary plants are associated with just certain predators, and so some of them will increase the populations of syrphid, or might provide habitat and food for syrphid flies. Some of them might provide habitat for geochris, the big-eyed bugs. Some of them might provide habitat and food for other types of natural enemies, parasitic wasps. You have in your garden, because you've got such a diverse garden, you've got a whole diversity of pests. And each of these natural enemies attacks a certain group of pests. So you sort of have to balance out what you're encouraging with what your pests are. So it's a very complex little thing here. It's not simple. And that's one reason why I say that you probably already have enough diversity in your garden. One thing you do want to avoid if you're growing insectary plants is don't grow something that you don't like having in your garden. Grow it because you actually also like the plant. And second of all, don't grow something that's going to get weedy on you, because some of the insectary plants can get quite weedy, and then you have a weed problem. The other two ways of enhancing biological control, controlling ants and avoiding using pesticides, are ways that really can make a difference. If you put insectary plants out there, I don't think you're going to see a real noticeable difference right away, unless you're also doing something else. You just started growing insectary plants and gave up using certain broad spectrum insecticides at the same time, you will see a difference. Controlling ants, though, ants are very important in the maintenance of nice high populations of honeydew-producing insects like aphids, soft scales, whiteflies, mealybugs, probably also the lerpsillid, because ants, you've heard of how ants keep aphids as cows, how they farm them, and it certainly is really true. The ants will find a colony of aphids on a tree. They'll spread those aphids out to different parts of the tree so they'll reproduce and thrive, and they'll stand there and knock off any lady beetles or parasitic wasps that try to attack the aphids. And they really do get those aphid populations booming. And so often you'll see a whole line of ants going up the trunk of a tree. And when you see a whole line of ants going up a trunk of a tree, that usually means you have something up there producing honeydew, because the ants aren't going up there for the view. They're, ants are there to get food for their colonies, because they have a colony somewhere, probably in the ground or in a wood pile or somewhere around there, and they're trying to get a lot of immature larvae grown up into ants, getting a very big colony. And so they are going out there and they're getting the honeydew from the ants in your tree, crawling back down and feeding it to their larvae and building up a really big colony. And so whenever you see a line of ants going up in a tree, it's a good sign there's something up there that's producing food. Usually it's one of these honeydew producing insects. It could be if you got rotting peaches on the tree, they might be going up to get the sugar from that. It could be you might have some disease or canker up there that has sap coming out, and that also could be a source. What we have found with research is that if you can control those ants, if you can keep the ants out of the tree, and we've done this with a couple of different species of soft scales in research projects at Davis, if you can keep those ants out of the tree, and you can do that by putting sticky tanglefoot around the trunk of the tree and then trimming the tree so that there's not a branch next to the garage where they can get up in the back door that way. The natural enemies will often control the pest. And that's the end of the story. So try managing ants. Don't let ants go up in the tree and tend the aphids or the soft scales. So ant management is really important in increasing biological control of these honeydew-producing insects. I might also add that the reverse is true. Managing honeydew-producing insects is important in the management of ants. I mean, this is an ecosystem. This is not just your apple tree or your tulip tree. This is your house that's next to it. And by gosh, if you have huge amounts of ants coming into your house every year, you might want to think about whether there are plants next to your house that produce a lot of honeydew, or else have fruit or other sweet things that can keep a colony of ants alive, or a colony of ants booming. Often persistent ant problems are associated with also persistent honeydew problems in trees, because you've got this huge colony of ants that's been able to develop because of the honeydew producers. So often it's a good idea to remove trees that have constant honeydew being produced from next to the house in order to reduce the ant problems in your house. So one thing is for sure is you can't kill all the ants. As much as you think you would like to, it is impossible to control all the ants in your yard. And you don't really want to, because despite the fact we don't like them in our house and we don't like them tending our aphids, other than that, ants do a lot of good in the garden. They are also predaceous. They feed on other insects. They feed on termites. So they're beneficial in the system, really, with those sort of two exceptions. So the most important way, though, to encourage natural enemies is to avoid using pesticides that kill them. And we have consistently killed natural enemies in our gardens through the use of pesticides. Now we're back to classical biological control. I have my little illustration here. This is the ash whitefly. And some of you may remember the ash whitefly from about 10 years ago, when it was a really serious, nasty pest in Sacramento area. Particularly on ash trees, but a lot of other ornamental trees. The leaves were turning yellow, honeydew was dripping all over everybody, and the leaves were dropping, and it was just a terrible mess. This ash whitefly came in very suddenly over about a 2-year period in the early 1990s, spread from Southern California to Northern California in less than a year, and was just causing havoc. Fortunately, there was a real serious outbreak on the Capitol Park there, and so the legislators noticed it falling on their heads, so there was a little bit of research money given to try to look at biological control of this whitefly. This is, of course, the adult whitefly. Looks big on the screen, but it is very small. It's very difficult to distinguish whitefly species in the adult stage. This looks like the greenhouse whitefly or the silverleaf whitefly in the adult stage. But the nymphal stage of the ash whitefly is quite distinctive. It has this sort of stripe of wax, and then also the nodules of wax on the hairs around it. So this was a fairly distinctive looking whitefly, and it still is. They brought in a little first of all, they had to figure out where did this whitefly come from, and they figured out that it came from the Mediterranean region, and so they sent some entomologists down there, and they brought back this little parasitic wasp, this little Carcia wasp, which lays its eggs inside the whitefly nymphs. Brought it from Israel. And they also brought a little lady beetle. This is a little lady beetle that feeds primarily on the whiteflies, and imported this and released this also. And they only released it in really a relatively few spots in California, but both of these natural enemies just spread across the state, and we don't see outbreaks of the ash whitefly anymore. It's just amazing. The whitefly is still there because I monitor toyon, and sometimes I see it in citrus, but it's very low populations, and when you do see it, you usually see evidence of parasites or predators there too. So really, this was an excellent example of biological control being successful. However, if you went out there and sprayed your ash tree with 7, which is really toxic to little parasitic wasps, you probably could develop your own outbreak of ash whitefly, because you would kill off these natural enemies. So we want to try to avoid killing natural enemies with pesticides. And we know this is not a problem with this guy. How do we know that?
He's not wearing protective clothing.
Very good. He's not wearing goggles, and he's not wearing gloves, and so that means he's probably just spraying water, which really isn't going to do much damage to natural enemies. However, he is better equipped than my neighbor is, but using things like water sprays or soap sprays are not very toxic to natural enemies, and are good examples of combining compatible control techniques with biological control. So the key in choosing pesticides is to choose the most selective pesticide that's effective. And of course, I'm an entomologist. I'm very interested in biological control. So we are trying to preserve the natural enemies, and that is a concern. But also, we are trying to preserve other organisms in the environment that may not be killing pests, but are beneficial in one way or the other. So we're trying to choose selective pesticides in an integrated pest management program. And the best selective pesticide is the one that just kills that one target pest that you want to hit. There's not many pesticides that are that selective, but that's the goal. On the other end of the scale is the broad spectrum pesticide, and the broad spectrum pesticide kills a large range of organisms, from the pest to its natural enemies, to honeybees, to fish, and your dog and your kid, and earthworms, and all kinds of organisms in a broad spectrum insecticide. Sometimes a broad spectrum pesticide is the only thing available, but we can make it more selective by being very selective about how we use it. For instance, if you can just use it around the trunk of a tree, for instance, and in such a manner that it doesn't get farther out into the environment. And sometimes that's the best choice. So some of the insecticides, in terms of their toxicity, natural enemies, and their selectivity. The most selective insecticide that we have right now that is being used for for homes and gardens is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacterial disease of insects. The common strain, the most commonly used strain, is selective just for caterpillars. That means the larvae of butterflies and moths. And it doesn't affect other insects, so that means it doesn't affect any of the predators or parasites or honeybees, and it's doesn't affect pets and other wildlife unless they happen to be in the Lepidoptera family and feed on it. There's other strains of BT that are used against flies. There's the mosquito dunks that you can put in ponds. Those only affect flies, so they're selective as well. So a lot of people are concerned about Bacillus thuringiensis, and you'll probably get questions about this. People are concerned because it's toxic to caterpillars, the larvae of butterflies. Is it going to impact the butterflies that we like to have in our garden, the monarch butterflies and the other swallowtail butterflies and the other butterflies that we enjoy having in our garden? The thing to remember with Bacillus thuringiensis is that the caterpillar, it doesn't affect the adult. It has to be eaten by the caterpillar. And so it has to be ingested. So the only caterpillar that's going to be affected is the one that is feeding on your tomato plant or your cabbage plant. The butterflies that we like having in our garden don't feed on your cabbage plant generally. Most of the attractive butterflies that we like have fairly narrow food choices, and so that like the anise swallowtail feeds on anise only, and the monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed. And so you don't want to treat those plants if you want to encourage the butterfly. But generally, you're not trying to protect those plants anyway. The other thing about BT is it breaks down within about 24 hours. So I don't really consider, if you're just treating the plants you want to protect, perhaps if you were doing an aerial spray over the entire county so that you were getting those weedy plants, yeah, that would be a problem. But if you're just treating those vegetables in your garden that you're concerned about, this is not going to have a negative impact on the butterflies. Now, on the other hand, if you have a butterfly garden, and you know, some people don't actually really understand this. If you're creating a butterfly garden, you have to realize that you're going to have some damage because the butterflies come from caterpillars and the caterpillars have to eat the plants. So you're going to see holes in those plants. And you don't want to try to control the caterpillars. Other insecticides that are quite compatible with natural enemies are oils and soaps, insecticidal oils, insecticidal soaps. These kill insects by smothering. Well, the primary way is by sort of smothering the insects. They can kill natural enemies if they completely coat the natural enemies, but they have no residual toxicity. So any natural enemies coming in later, any that are protected within a mummy or an insect, aren't going to be impacted. So they are quite compatible with natural enemies, partly because they break down so rapidly. The botanical insecticides, and these are insecticides that are derived from plants. The pyrethrin is the most common one that we see around. Pyrethrin is derived from the pyrethrum daisy. These are actually fairly broadly toxic initially, and pyrethrum is quite toxic to fish. And it's also toxic to cats. But it breaks down rapidly, like within 24 to 48 hours. So again, it's not that toxic because of the short persistence of the toxicity. Neem is another botanical that has become more recently on the market. And again, that's broadly toxic but breaks down fairly rapidly. The pesticides that really aren't compatible with natural enemies are the organophosphates, like diazinon and dursban and malathion and orthene or acephate. Also Sevin, which is a carbamate, and the pyrethroids like permethrin. They are highly toxic on contact, but more importantly is that they leave toxic residues for days, weeks, and sometimes months, so that a natural anemone landing on a treated leaf maybe 2 weeks later is going to be killed. So the choices, the less toxic choices that we're trying to encourage people to use, and this is all I really feel people need to use for controlling insects in their gardens, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions that are rarely needed, are these materials. The narrow-range oils, which can be petroleum oils. There's a lot of products that are sun oil. There's many oil products there that are formulated as insecticide. These are narrow-range oils. They aren't toxic to plants if used properly, and the plants are not drought-stressed. Insecticidal soaps, which work similar to oils but aren't quite as effective. Now, oils and soaps are effective on soft-bodied insects like aphids, scale nymphs, nymphs of hemiptera like lace bugs, mites, thrips. They are not effective on beetles. They're not effective on caterpillars of larvae of butterflies or moths, or insects that have more protective kinds of cuticle. A mealybug is a soft, yeah. All the homopterans, whiteflies. The insecticidal soaps are not quite as effective as the oils, but they're easier to use. They come in these little spray bottles, and you can just squirt them on. So they're very convenient for using on herbaceous annual plants. To use the oil, you have to have pressurized equipment, and you got to get it all out there. And so usually oils are used on trees. BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, we talked about, and pyrethrum and neem also. However, when you use these less toxic insecticides, they're definitely more difficult to use than the diazinon and dursban that we're used to. Because remember, those insecticides left toxic residues for at least a week, and so you could be a little bit sloppy about your application. But with these less toxic materials, you have to be more careful. You have to time the applications more carefully in order to get effectiveness. Otherwise, they won't work. And so people can be disappointed by the results. So and also most of them only control certain pests. If you take something like diazinon, it controls everything. You don't even need to think. But if you're going to make a choice in your garden, you would use an oil for your aphids, but that wouldn't control your caterpillars. You'd want to use your BT for your caterpillars. So you have to really make some careful choices here. They break down rapidly in the environment, usually within a day or so, so you can't spray it and then think it's going to continue to control pests that hatch out later on. All these materials require good coverage. You have to really cover that leaf so that the caterpillar will eat it, and you have to cover that aphid with the oil or the soap. These materials don't give 100% kill, so not everything's going to be gone, and anybody who's used insecticidal soap really knows that, because it only kills like maybe 60% if you're lucky. But the good thing about it is that does leave something for the natural enemies to feed on, and that way you can have an integrated program of biological control and use of these materials. You may have to put a second or third application on. And you want to combine them with other kinds of methods because they're not 100% effective. Again, refer to our recommendations. I'm just going to go through some of these the bad old pesticides that we're phasing out on, but people are still using and are still valuable in limited circumstances. The first group is the organophosphates. And the organophosphates have really been the largest, the biggest group and most popularly used insecticides for about the last 30 years, ever since DDT was phased out. The organophosphates work as nerve poisons. They were originally created as chemicals, as nerve gases during World War II. So they're broad spectrum because the nervous system of people and insects uses the same chemicals. So that's one reason why they're toxic to people too, because they're working on the similar chemicals in our nervous system. So that makes them broad spectrum. They're hard on biological control. Most of these products leave residues for at least several days, and often for weeks, maybe even a month. They tend to have varying mammalian toxicity depending on the material. They have been certainly associated with the stormwater concerns. The diazinon and chlorpyrifos have definitely been fingered as getting into our storm drains and getting into our creeks and killing aquatic invertebrates, which are at the bottom of the food chain for fish. And so the dursban and the diazinon are going out. Malathion, also an organophosphate, is still around. That was the one that was associated with the medfly. It's not as toxic to humans. It's not as effective as an insecticide either. My sense is that it's probably going to go out too, though, because it does have some potential problems. The disulfoton or dicyston, which is used primarily in roses in the home garden. That's the thing. It's often, rose insect control. It's usually applied as a granule, sometimes formulated with a fertilizer, and people put it on their roses. It's taken up in the plant, and it does control sucking insects like aphids. That is just about the most toxic insecticide available for the home use. You can't use it on food crops. You can't use it on much other than roses. But people should be aware of that. And I think in most cases that a pesticide of that toxicity isn't justified when you can use insecticidal soap. And then the final organophosphate here is orthene, also a systemic, not so toxic by its initially to mammalian toxicity is fairly low, but it does break down to a more toxic material, a very toxic material, and that's one reason why it's not allowed on food crops for home gardens. Again, I would avoid it. Of the carbamates, really the only material that's used in the garden is 7, and since diazinon and dursban are being phased out, this is probably one of the most common materials used. It has a lower mammalian toxicity. It has also been found in the water, and so some people are concerned about it, but not so regularly that it's on the out list yet. But it is extremely hard on honeybees, parasitic wasps, beneficials, earthworms. I mean, it's devastating to that invertebrate ecosystem that you're trying to maintain in your garden, and I really recommend that you avoid it for pretty much everything except maybe codling moth, if you insist on treating codling moth. But it does remain toxic for a really long time. That's why it's good for codling moth. It doesn't work on sucking insects, even though the labels say sucking insects, and that's one of the things, the label. We always say read the label, but when we say read the label, what we mean is read the label for information on disposal and safety equipment. The companies tend to put every insect they can think of on the label. They don't have to prove efficacy, and often the insects that are listed on the label, the material really isn't very effective for. And that's true of 7 with aphids and other sucking insects. It's not very effective. You shouldn't use it. And for mites, it actually causes the mites to reproduce more. Mites love it. And so it causes mite outbreaks. If you want, don't use the label for choosing what pest or the pesticide, matching a pest and a pesticide. Use the pest note, see what's suggested there. And then the pyrethroids are a newer group of insecticides of concern. They are, because the diazinon and dursban are being phased out, we're going to see more of them because they're a broad spectrum material for insects that is very persistent, And so you can apply it and it'll control insects for many weeks after you control it. So this will be an easy alternative for people to use. It doesn't have a very high mammalian toxicity. But it is very broad spectrum for insects, and it's really nasty on natural enemies. Permethrin is one common name, but there's some other products too. The only place I think that it's justified is trunk treatments for borers. They're very toxic to fish. So avoid these products. They will be promoted. I think we're going to see water quality problems with them also, but we don't have the chemical knowledge to detect them yet. It's they don't have really good tests for detecting the pyrethroids in the water as yet.
The preceding program was part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.